Welcome to week 3 of biobehavior. In this lesson, you will continue to explore the psychological core of consumer behavior, and in particular, you will learn about 3 very important processes: exposure, attention, and perception. There are 3 learning objectives to this lesson. First, we will discuss why marketers are concerned about consumers' exposure to marketing stimuli and what tactics they can use to make exposure more likely. Second, we will explain the characteristics of attention and how marketers can create offerings and messages that are more likely to catch consumers' attention. And lastly, we will describe the 5 major senses that are part of perception, and we will discuss some of their properties and implications for marketing. In order for any marketing stimulus to have an impact, consumers must first be exposed to it. Then they must allocate some attention to it, and finally, they must perceive it through the 5 senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Perception and attention are actually mutually reinforcing processes. Some basic level of attention is needed so we can perceive a stimulus. But once a stimulus is perceived, further attention-based resources can be used to process the stimulus at higher levels of processing. We'll talk about these higher levels of processing over the next couple of weeks when we discuss the topic of comprehension, learning, and memory. Now, just take this scenario as an example. Assume that Cirque du Soleil is advertising a new show in Melbourne, and one of the medias they've chosen to advertise the show on is on the side of buses. Now, how likely are you to consider going to the show? Well, first, you must learn about the show. That is, you have to come in contact or be exposed to the ad about the show. Well, you will be exposed to the ad only if you are actually in the area where these buses travel, assuming that that's the only media in which they advertise. But even if you're exposed to the ad, you may not pay attention to it because you may be, let's say, talking on the phone when the bus drives by. And then, finally, even if you pay attention to the ad, you may still not perceive or comprehend it correctly if the bus drives by very quickly. So you may, for example, get the impression that the ad is for an animation movie. So exposure is the very first threshold of 3 thresholds: attention, perception, and exposure, attention, and perception, through which a marketing stimulus has to go through so that it can have an impact on consumers. We define exposure as the process by which consumers come into contact with the stimulus. Now, exposure has some properties and effects. The first and most obvious property or effect of exposure is that it creates awareness. So, this is becoming more and more of a challenge these days, however, the more information consumers are bombarded with. And that is why the cost for commercials in primetime TV has skyrocketed recently. For example, the cost of a 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl, which is the most watched sporting event in the US, has increased roughly 8 times over the past 25 years. Exposure has some additional effects besides creating awareness. Repeated exposure to an object or a message, for example, can increase the liking for this object or message. This interesting effect was discovered first by a psychologist, Robert Zients, in 1968, and it is referred to as the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect applies to pretty much any type of stimulus. And for example, think how sometimes when you hear a new song or album for the first time, you may not like it very much. But then the more you listen to it, the more the music grows on you and you like it more. Now, this, of course, is true only up to a point. After a certain point, any additional repetitions of the stimulus can actually have the opposite effect, because we become bored with it. That is why we say that the relationship between repeated exposure and liking is best described by an inverted U-curve. Now think of the implication in a marketing context, and in particular for decisions such as how often to run commercials. Marketers have to find the fine balance between too little exposure or too few repetitions and too much exposure or too many repetitions. There is one more important effect related to repeated exposure. Assume that you read in a blog online that, for example, eating broccoli reduces blood pressure. If you never heard this before, you may doubt whether it's true. But if it sounds familiar, even though you can't remember where you've heard this statement, you may be more inclined to believe that it's true. So familiarity with the message, which comes from the repeated exposure to the message, gives us the feeling of increased truthfulness. That is, the more often we come across a statement, the more likely we are to think that it's true. And again, think of the implications of this effect for the perceived truthfulness of advertising claims. So I hope that I've convinced you of the importance of exposure. However, we should keep in mind that consumers can select not to be exposed to unwanted marketing messages. For example, they can block unwanted online ads, skip commercials which they watch on TV, fast forward through commercials, which is also known as zapping, or just switch between channels, which is called zapping. The previous one is called zipping and this one is called zapping. And there are more and more sophisticated software options on the market which allow consumers to select what they get exposed to. So the old model of pushing advertising messages onto the consumer is actually no longer working. So what is the solution? Companies these days understand more and more the value of what we call targeted exposure. That is, targeting your advertising messages only to consumers who are likely to be interested in them, and that is, not avoid exposure to them. Which underlies again the importance of personal relevance, the topic from last week. Besides making exposure more targeted, companies can also increase the likelihood of exposure by selecting carefully the position of the message or the location of the product. For example, ads which are placed on the front or back pages of magazines are likely to get a lot more exposure than ads which are placed inside the magazine. And products which are placed on shelves that are at the eye level of the target consumer are also more likely to be seen and picked up.